Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's history lesson. My name is Mr. Dixon. This lesson is brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with the Saibono Discovery Center. Learners, today we are going to do an overview of paper 2 that you are writing tomorrow. So please take note, it's an overview. Overview means we are not going to go into detail. We will just brush through the different topics. But today we are only going to deal with 4 topics basically, meaning 2 source-based topics and 2 essay topics. But it is pertinent that we understand that today we are first going to deal with section A, which is the source-based part. Then we will deal with section B, which is the essay part. So very important that tomorrow's paper, it will be set out as you can see on the screen. Section A, number 1, will be the civil resistance 1970 to 1980s in South Africa. Then the question focus there will be the crisis of apartheid in the 1980s, meaning internal resistance in South Africa. That will be question 1. Then question 2 will be the coming of democracy to South Africa and the coming to terms with the past, basically. And the focus there will be the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Then question 3 will be the end of the Cold War and a new order of from 1989 to the present. And the focus there is globalization. So section A will be the source-based. Now remember, learners, in order for you to answer section A, you must know that you can only answer 2 questions in section A. You can't answer all 3. You can only answer 2. When we go to section B, it's the essay part. It's civil resistance 1970 to 1980s. The question focus there is now the challenge of black consciousness to the apartheid state, basically. So this will be then question 4. This will be question 4 tomorrow. And this one will be question 5. And this one will be question 6. Now, question 5 will be as follows: the coming of democracy to South Africa and coming to terms with the past. And the focus there will be the negotiating settlement and the government of national unity. Then question 6 will be the end of the Cold War and the New World Order. And the question focus there will be the end of the Cold War and the events of 1989, basically. So learners, this is basically the setup of the question paper tomorrow. So now you have a overview, you have an insight to how the question paper might look like tomorrow. But it is pertinent, like I said to you guys earlier, you can only answer 3 questions. And you must answer at least 2 source-based, 1 essay. Or you answer 2 essays, 1 source-based. As you can see on the screen, it says answer 3 questions as follows. 4.1, at least one must be a source-based question and at least one must be a essay question. 4.2, the third question can either be a source-based or a essay question. Then we advise you are advised to spend at least 1 hour per question, because if you're doing 3 questions, it means you must spend 1 hour per question, basically. Then that is just now the structure or the instructions, how the paper will be set up. So let's quickly go into how you should interpret source-based questions at the end of the day. It is pertinent, learners, that we understand that all questions, when we say questions, remember section A has got question 1, question 2, and question 3. Now, all 3 questions basically has got what we call level 1, level 2, level 3, level 1, 2, 3. Then we have level 1, 2, 3, basically. So now we can clearly see that all 3 questions will have level 1, 2, and 3. Now, what is level 1 questions? So this is what we call level 1, 2, and 3 is what we call the cognitive level of questioning, basically. So level 1, it requires you to do extractions from the source. So once you basically see that, and we will go into detail, what is a level 1 question? So once you see level 1 questions, you must know it is a it is extraction. Now, extraction, learners, it is basically what you remove from the source. So from level 1 question, you will find that 12 marks, it's in the source. Then the definition is 2 marks, and that will give you 4 marks basically at the end of the day. Then you go to level 2 questions. It talks about interpretation of evidence from the sources. You must explain information that you've gathered from the different sources, and then you must analyze the evidence from the sources. And that's what we call level 2 questions basically. Then level 3, you must interpret, evaluate evidence from sources. For example, the question will be phrased, comment on the usefulness, explain how reliable the source is, or comment how reliable the source is, or comment on the usefulness basically. Then you will be finding questions like biasness and limitations as such. You will be finding questions where you must compare and give the contrast, and you must be able to interpret it. So you gather information from the sources and interpret and analyze it as per se. So now we can see this is 14 marks, and this is 20 marks, and this one is 16 marks, and that gives you a total of 50 marks at the end of the day. So all three questions, question 1, 2, and 3, this is 50, 50, 50 basically. So remember, learners, how must you answer paper 2? It can either be 2 source based, 1 essay, or 2 essays, 1 source based. But the cognitive levels, it's important how you answer your sources. Now let's go into level 1 questions. Level 1 questions require you to do what? Extract. What is extract? Remove from source and define historical concepts basically. Now they carry a maximum mark basically of 1 times 1, 2 times 1, 1 times 2, sometimes 3 times 1, or sometimes 4 times 1 also. Then we find question verbs. Now the question verbs, once you see these words, then you need to know already it is a level 1 question. For example, quote, list, identify, name. Once you see these words in that particular sentence, then you need to tell yourself it is a level 1 question already. Then you find typical questions. Now, what is typical questions? Typical questions is how the sentence or the question is being phrased, basically. For example, what information in the source tells you? Quote, 2 reasons from the source. What do you understand by the term according to the source, basically? Now these are just examples of typical level 1 questions. So once you see these questions, and like I said, the question verbs, they are in the sentence. For example, if you look at quote 2, quote, it is basically what we call a question verb. Once you see them, you know it's extraction from the sources basically. Then we go over to level 2 questions. Level 2 questions require you to interpret, analyze, and engage with evidence from the sources. They carry a maximum mark of 4 marks, basically 2 times 2. Now, what are the question verbs for level 2? Explain, comment, describe, organize. But when we look at explain, when we look at comment, they can also be utilized. Explain and comment can also be utilized in level 3 questions also. But they are, firstly, they are level 2 questions. Basically, they are level 2 question verbs. Then the typical questions, how will they ask this particular question basically? What message does the cartoonist convey, or what message does the source convey? Explain in your own words. Why do you think according to the source in your own knowledge? And this is what we call typical level 2 questions. It means this is how the questions will be phrased in tomorrow's question paper basically. Then we move over to level 3 question. Now level 3 questions, we will go more into detail basically. So level 3 questions require you to explain the different perspectives from the sources, draw conclusions about how reliable is the source, how useful is the source, and with regards to the limitations of particular sources. These questions carry a maximum mark of 8 to 4 marks. Why 8 marks? Because of the paragraph. So the paragraph is also level 3 question basically. Then what are the question verbs? Compare, contrast, comment, justify. Then the typical questions would be explain to what extent the evidence in source 1A supports the evidence in 1B also. So you must compare the evidence in source 1A would be comment on the usefulness, or even explain on the usefulness of so it says here on the screen, comment on the usefulness, how reliable is the source, limitations from the source, and in the paragraph also. So this is what we call level 3 questions. Now let's go to the mark allocation before we move deeper into level 3 questions. So we all need to understand, learners, that the number in front, the one that you see that it's circled in red, the number in front means the amount of responses that needs to be provided. So when we look at the amount of responses, we are basically looking at the answers that must be provided. Like the first one that's circled in red, it says 1 times 2. It means one answer, but you will receive 2 marks for one answer. Then the second one shows 2 times 2. It means 2 answers must be provided. Each one will be 2 marks, basically. Then it is pertinent that we understand that the numbers in the middle, they are the mark allocation as per se. The ones in front, the amount of answers you must provide, and the one in the middle, the amount of marks that will be awarded, basically. So if you see a mark allocation of 1 times 1, 2 times 1, 3 times 1, then you must know it's extraction. And what are extractions? They are level 1 questions, basically. Then when you see a mark allocation of 2 times 2, it equals 4, it means you must interpret it, or you must analyze that particular question. But to analyze and interpret, you must have studied the content of the particular topic that you are answering, basically. Now, remember, learners, after reading the question, you must always look at the mark allocation. That will guide you how you should answer this question and the amount of responses or the amount of answers you must provide, basically. Now, types of level 3 questions. How do sources support each other, compare, contrast, biasness of sources, how reliable is the source, usefulness, limitations of the different sources. So when we look at support, so what do you do when they say, how does source A support source B? The question is asked that how similar are the two sources from each other. It means you must remove similarities, basically. So what do you do now? How do you answer it? You go to source 1A and you find something in that source that is supported or says or shows the same thing in source 1B, basically. And this is how you answer it. You write down source 1A. You write down source 1A says they are aggressive people. And this is supported by 1B, which says the people were violent, basically. So aggression and violence, it comes down on the same idea, basically. Now, learners, that will give you now 2 marks. Very important that we understand. Now you need to go back and you need to find another example of something that the two sources have got in common. For example, in source 1A, says the people are joyous, and this is supported by 1B, which says the people were laughing. Joyous, laughing, same thing, similarities. So it's important that we understand that we need to go back twice. But now if the words are the same, say for instance, you say now that the learners were aggressive, and source 1B says the learners were aggressive also. Now you say both sources indicate the learners are aggressive because the words are the same. Only when the words are not spelled the same, then we need to say source 1A says, and is supported by 1B, which says now you must mention, you can't say it's the same thing. You must say, if in 1A it talks about aggression, and this is supported by 1B, which says the people are violent. So you can't say source 1B is the same like 1A. No. Exactly like I said to you. But as we go through, we will be working through some activities that will be making things clearer for you. Then contrast. Contrast in paper 1, question 1, the compare question was basically contrast. Now, what is contrast? Contrast means the opposite, if it's contradicting, if it's not the same, basically. So what do? You go to the first source and you find something that is opposite, that is contradicting, that is not the same like in the following source. So how do you answer it? You write source 1A says the people are aggressive, and this is contradicted by source 1B, which says the people are joyful, basically. So can we see now? So in 1A it says the people are aggressive, in 1B we say the people are joyous, basically. So what are the differences? It is basically aggressive and joyous at the end of the day. So the opposite must be clearly seen within the different sources. Now, after doing that, now we give you 2 marks. So now you need to go back and you look for other differences, basically, other uh, opposite to what is in the different types of sources. So after you've done that, that will give you your 4 marks at the end of the day, basically. So now you will be looking at biasness. Now, what is biasness, learners? Biasness means it's from one viewpoint, or it is from one individual or from one country. And also when the source is biased, it is limited, basically, because it doesn't give you the full answer that you basically need. And you also need to look at the motives of certain words, and that will guide you how you should answer them. Then let's go to how reliable. So reliability can be asked as in the following manner: explain how reliable the source is, comment on the reliability of the source. So it can be asked in those two ways, basically. Now, how do you get to the answer? The first question that you ask, is the source accurate? The second one is, can it be trusted, basically? Now, if the answer is yes, can be trusted, it is accurate. Now you go to the source. Who wrote the source? Meaning the source was written by John van Niekerk. 2 marks. When was the source made? The source was made in 1947. Another 2 marks. Why was it created? Now you summarize the content. Why? Because if you summarize the content, now it gives you idea why it was created. Is the evidence in the source consistent with evidence from other sources? It means, can it be corroborated with at the end of the day? So how do you answer number 4 now? Point number 4. Point number 4, you will indicate the source is consistent with source 1A, which informs us the people are aggressive. The source is consistent with 1B, which informs us that the people were violent, basically. So this is how you answer how reliable. You look at the 4 bullets here, and that should guide you how you should answer it, basically. Now, how do we answer usefulness? The usefulness of the source basically depends on the purpose of this particular source. So the question that you need to ask is it accurate? Now, a source is not accurate if there is a date. Take note, the source is not accurate if there is a date. So if there's a date, it means the source is accurate at the end of the day. Does it mean what it says? Can it be corroborated? Who produced it? So now we can see the same questions that were basically asked in reliability. That's what we ask in usefulness, basically, at the end of the day. So learners, you must focus on the message of the source. Why must we focus on the message? Because the message of the source, it is basically what we should answer in the paragraph question as per se. Now let's look at limitations. So these kind of questions point to the quality of the sources. So why is the source limited? The source is limited if it's biased, if it cannot prove how reliable and how useful the source is, for instance. For example, the source can be limited because it comes from one side. So what does it mean? Biasness. The source is limited because it is not accurate, it is not consistent with the other sources. The source is basically limited because there's no date, there's no author at the same time also. Now let's go to the paragraph part, basically. So this question is worth what we say 8 marks. It is assessed using a holistic analytical rubric. The question is phrased so that it is a level 3 question. For example, explain the role, impact, causes, effects, or significance of a particular historical event. The paragraph question always relates back to the key question. So let's just pause for a little bit. So if it relates back to the key question, so the key question is the bold words on top, and then you find question 1, then you find question 2, then you find question 3, basically. So the key question, it is basically your paragraph question. So when you answer 1A, you underline what's answering the key question. When you underline the information in 1B, you underline because it's answering the key question. So once you get now to the paragraph question, less time will be wasted. Why will less time be wasted? Because now you've underlined and you will just paraphrase. What is paraphrase? Paraphrase means I do not copy paste, I do not write it down as is, basically. So what do you do now? You actually ensure that it's paraphrased, you leave out certain word, but the main character within that particular sentence remains there at the end of the day, basically. So learners, so that is basically how you should answer your source-based questions, basically. So it is pertinent that we understand that no learner is supposed to get less than 22 marks, basically. Why? Because if you get less than 22 marks, it means there's a serious issue with yourself, basically. Now let's quickly go into how you should write a essay in history, basically. So we'll go through how you should do the stuff, and then we'll basically go for a break. When we come back from the break, we will actually move into the content, basically. Now, it is pertinent, learners, that every essay has got requirements. And the first requirement when writing an essay is the learners must take a stance. They must develop a relevant and coherent line of argument, basically. Now, the line of argument must be supported with relevant historical evidence, facts. This is organized and connected chronologically to a question being posed. Now, take note, learners, you must start at the start with an essay. Chronological means 1, 2, 3, 4. Chronological does not mean 4, 2, 3, and 1, basically. No, that this is not chronological. This year, this is what we call chronological order. So it means the sequence of events must follow after each other. And that will actually force you into learners that you need to study well, actually. Like I said, today is just an overview. It's just to see if you are on the right path as you are basically studying. Now, essay questions are asked in what we say 3 ways. These questions that you see on the screen are not in any chronological order for tomorrow's question paper. So question 4 could be critically discussed. Question 4 could be do you agree? Question 4 could be explained to what extent, basically. So it can be either of the 3 that you see on the screen. So how do you take your stance? When it's critically discussed, approve or now one can approve, one can disapprove, or it can be approved upon, or it can be disapprove upon. Very important that we understand that part, and that's when we take our stance. Now, do you agree? It is one can agree, one can disagree, or it can be agreed upon, or it can be disagreed upon. Then explain to what extent, either to a less, or to a greater, or to a larger. So take note, learners, it is either to a greater or to a less, but the greater can be written as larger at the same time. So there will be, so this is in no chronological order. It doesn't mean that tomorrow's paper will be asked like this. But when we look at critically discuss, and do you agree, normally have what we call a statement on top. So they ask the statement, and at the bottom they will say critically discuss this following essay by using relevant evidence. Then to come to do you agree, they will give you the statement, and the same pattern that in critically discuss is being followed in do you agree. Then to explain to what extent it is either to a less or to a greater or larger extent. Now to what extent, basically, learners, how do you answer them when you take your stance? You say to a less extent, and then you continue why you took that particular stance, basically. But very important now, let's look at the structure of the essay. So the structure of the essay normally starts with the introduction. Very important that we understand what is a introduction. It introduces us to the particular topic that is going to be dealt with. So the first thing that you need to do is you must have a direct response to the question, basically. Second thing, reason why you took the stance. Now the reason is information in the body, in the content, basically. Then the last part of the introduction is the line of argument that is going to be followed in the rest of the essay. Now, very important, learners, that if you read the first sentence of a paragraph, of the first paragraph of a longer piece or writing, you cannot work out clearly what the original question was. Then the introduction is flawed, basically. So these are the 3 things that must be in. You must have a direct response. So we will be looking into it now. Now let's look quickly into the 3 steps that is supposed to be in the introduction. So the 3 steps are as follows. Step 1, stance and reference to question. Do you agree or disagree? So you will not say to agree or to disagree. You will say one, or it can be agreed upon, or it can be disagreed upon, basically. Then to a large extent, or to a less extent, basically. One can approve, one can disapprove, basically. So it's important that we understand that that is how we start the stand sentence, with these words that I've just mentioned now. And then you write down the statement that is being asked, basically. Then the reason, it is, like I said, you retrieve two examples from the source that you are going to talk about, basically. Then step three is what we call orientation. Orientation, we know, learners, that the orientation is basically to inform us what you are going to write about, basically. So I cannot say what is coming in tomorrow because I've not seen the paper. But you need to understand that in the introduction, there must be three phases, basically, or three steps at the end of the day, basically. Then the body. Now take note, before, when we're done with the introduction, we find a background paragraph. Why background paragraph? Because it creates the basis for the body to be built upon, basically. So the body should look as follows. It must contain all the relevant factual material of this particular content, and it should be explicitly linked to the line of argument, which is our Peel method. So the Peel method needs to be introduced, basically. It means there must be a point, example, explain, and link it either to the next paragraph or to the key question, basically. Then it should be well structured. Take note. So we're talking about structure now here. So the introduction is there, the background paragraph is there, only one background paragraph, learners. Then we find the body. So the body could be basically 7 to 10 to 15 pages long, basically, depending on your handwriting, because not every learner writes the same. Not every learner will be able to write maybe 3 pages because of the small handwriting, but others will be writing maybe 9 or 10 or 15 pages, basically. But very important that as it's been structured, it must be written down chronologically in a coherent manner, displaying the good information, basically. And you must give examples to reinforce the stance that you took, basically. Now let's look at the Peel method quickly. So the Peel method, the P means the opening sentence or statement in this particular paragraph. Then you must explain it. The next few sentences in a paragraph should explain the point you just took. So your explanation can be one or maybe 2 sentences long. It's up to you. Then evidence must be provided. It means you must give examples of the why you took the stance, basically. Then link it. You link it either to the introduction paragraph, to the first sentence there, or you link it to the second or the paragraph that will follow after this particular paragraph. Now, learners, this is what we call the Peel method. So the Peel method will not be in all the paragraphs. Take note of that. Only where the question is being answered, you implement the Peel method in those particular sentences. Now, also with the conclusion, also, what you do with the conclusion is you just go back to the introduction and you transfer. But with a conclusion, you must indicate it can be concluded, or by tying up the knot, or by just mention words that indicate closure, basically. Then the same examples utilized in the introduction, the same examples must be utilized in the conclusion, basically. So it's very important. Also, there are also 3 phases within the conclusion at the same time also. So learners, let's quickly go for a break, for a 5-minute break, and on our return we will start with the content. Thank you. Welcome back, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's history lesson. My name is Mr. Dixon. This lesson is brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with the Saibono Discovery Center. Learners, the first session we dealt with the different cognitive levels, level 1, level 2, level 3, and how you should answer those source-based questions. We also spoke about the setup, the structure of the question paper, how it will be set up, section A, section B. Section A has got 3 questions, section B has got 3 questions, and we also indicated to you that you need to answer 3 questions. And how should it be answered? 2 source base, 1 essay, or 2 essays and 1 source base basically. Then we actually went into the structure of the essay also at the same time. It's important that we understand when we look at the structure of the essay has got what we call a introduction, and the essays will be asked in 3 ways basically, but it's got it started with the introduction, background paragraph, there's a body. Now the body is not 1 paragraph, but take note, learners, that tomorrow they will ask you to write your essay in within the space of 3 pages. But remember, every learner writes differently. So others write small, they will not get to 3 pages. Others write big, but it's important that we complete the entire story, because remember, it's his story. So it means it's a story being told to you basically. Then very important that we understand that there's an introduction, background, different body paragraphs, meaning 7 to 8 to 12 to 15 paragraphs maybe. Then there's a conclusion also with the essay part basically. But remember now, every paragraph that's answering the question being asked, the peel method must be implemented in that particular paragraph basically. But let's go to the source base again. Remember, I said on our return we will be dealing with the content of the source base first, and then the content of the paragraph essays basically. Then what we need to understand, learners, is that section A, we are only going to deal with question 1 and question 2 basically. In section B, we are only going to deal with question 4 and question 5. That is the content. So remember, this is an overview. It's what you should know for tomorrow, basically. So let's look at question 1. Question 1 is internal resistance to apartheid in the 1980s. That is the focus of the question, basically. Now, remember now that the content there it's quite vague. There's a lot of information. So they could zoom into one particular topic or incident that occurred during that time. So the first bullet that you can see on the screen that you should focus on is the government's attempt to reform apartheid. Now the question is, why reform apartheid? Now we'll go into detail now why they had to reform apartheid. So the first thing that they did is, in 1982, they created what we call the Urban Bantu Authorities Act, or the Black Local Authorities Act, basically. Then in 1983, they started off with a tricameral system parliament, basically. Then the next bullet will indicate internal resistance to the reforms to the 1982 Urban Bantu Authorities Act and the tricameral parliament system in 1983. So there were internal resistance, and they were to the reforms that Botha introduced. Then the growing power of the trade union movement from 1973 up until the establishment of COSATU in the middle 1980s, basically. Then a response to Botha's reforms, new methods of mobilization occurred. Labor rollout mass actions, roles of civics, UDF role, mass democratic movement, and conscription campaign, and the Black Session. Now, this is basically the subtopics for internal resistance in South Africa, basically. Now, let's go to the reasons for the reform, basically. So it's important that we understand that the National Party believed there was a total onslaught on South Africa. So when we look at quickly the map of Southern Africa, we look at the map of Southern Africa, Okay, this is now South Africa. Then we find Namibia, Botswana. So this is Namibia, this is Botswana, this is Zimbabwe, this is Mozambique, and on top we find Angola basically. So remember, learners, that after World War One, South Africa received Namibia as a gift from the League of Nations because they defeated the Germans in Africa basically. So the Germans colonized Namibia. So South Africa defeated them in Namibia and in Tanzania basically. In 1975, Angola now became a communist country. And P.W. Botha indicated that if Angola is a communist country, Namibia now became the fifth province of South Africa. So if Angola infiltrate Namibia will become a communist country. And if they become a communist country, then South Africa obviously become a communist country because they were a province of South Africa. So he said there's a total onslaught of communism on South Africa, basically. Then he came up with what we call a total strategy. And the total strategy was called these reforms. What was the first reform in 1982? The Urban Bantu Authorities Act, basically. That was the first form. Now, what was the Urban Bantu Authorities Act of 1983? Let me just give you two things that was introduced there. They said that black people in townships, they can lease houses for 99 years. So it means now every month you need to pay rent. The only way you can lose your house if you don't pay rent, basically. The second one, the second reform was in 1983 when he introduced the tricameral parliament. As you can see on the screen, the tricameral parliament was basically House of Delegates for Indian people, House of Representatives for colored people, and House of Assemblies for whites, basically. Now, black people were excluded. So when we talk about the black people, take note, we know that black consciousness says that colors, Indians, they are also black. So the blacks were the Zulus, the Sutus, the Tswanas, the Pedis, Indibeles. So that is what we call the black people. They were excluded. Why? Because they were in the majority. So if there was voting that ought to take place, they would outvote the whites, basically. Then also, remember now that Zululand was a country on its own. So to leave Zululand, you must come with what we call a pass book. So this is why it was called the Dompas, because now you must leave Zululand, come to Bloemfontein, come to Johannesburg and work there on the mine. And those guys were called the migrant laborers, basically, at the end of the day. And for those two reasons, because blacks were in the majority, they would outvote whites, and because they had their own governments in the Bantustans, basically, or the homelands or the reserves, basically. So coloreds and Indians became part of parliament in 1983, but they had no say. So coloreds, Indians, Zulu, Sutus, they could only vote within their own local area. They could not vote nationally. They could not vote uh, provincially at the same time also. So this is the tricameral parliament, basically. Now take note, in defense to this, so when we go back, in defense to this, to Botha's reforms, there were methods of mobilization that took place, basically. So let's start off. The UDF was started to fight off the system of the tricameral parliament, basically. So what did the UDF do? They sent out signature. Now they sent out a list, and that campaign was called the million signature, basically. Then they went from house to house to ensure that people don't vote, basically. Don't vote campaign was also introduced. Then the civics became part of the UDF also, and the churches also became part of the UDF. So they were using the civics, the local organizations in the different communities, and they were using the church bodies also. And this is now where Frank Chakani came. He comes into the picture, and this is where Archbishop Desmond Tutu also come into the picture. But who was the leader of the UDF? The leader of the UDF was Reverend Ellen Busak, basically. Now he's called Dr. Reverend Ellen Busak. He was the leader of the UDF. But Archbishop Desmond Tutu was part of the UDF also. Frank Chakane was part. but they were part of the churches also at the same time. And the civics were the small organizations uh, that was introduced. Now take note, they could ask only on the tricameral parliament, they could only ask on the Urban Bantu Authorities Act, or they could only ask on the UDF, or they could only ask on the role of the civics, basically. Then what transpired is that in 1994, 1995, COSATU was basically established, and who was the leader there? It was our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa. He was the first leader of COSATU. Now, take note, before COSATU, in 1973, the trade unions was allowed to operate, basically. Then what transpired is that because of that, there were other uh, organizations that also came up with campaigns. For example, like the conscription campaign or the Black Sachet group of white women that were protesting against. Now, the end conscription campaign basically, end conscription means we need to end conscription. Now, what was conscription? Conscription meant basically that if you are white, and then if you're in grade 12, when you're done with school, you must go to the army, basically. So they used to go from school to school, deliver letters indicating that Peter, that John must report to the Potchefstroom's army base for next year in January, basically. And then a group of white people came together and they said, let's end the conscription campaign, basically. Let's remove the army out of the townships, basically. Then the Black Sachet, it was just white women that were protesting with black sachets across, and that was basically the different organizations. But in 1988, all organizations that were protesting against the apartheid system were banned in South Africa, including the UDF. So what did the UDF do? They just changed the name and it became Mass Democratic Movement, basically. And that was the change. So I gave you basically a synopsis, an overview of the content that you know for tomorrow, basically. And let's quickly go to the source now. Let's practice uh, based upon the little knowledge that I gave you. Let's read quickly the the caption of the source first. And this is what you need to do always. You read the caption of the source always first. The source below explains the reasons why P.W. Botha, President of the Republic of South Africa, introduced reforms in 1983. In early 1983, Botha attempted to ease the mounting pressures on the country by introducing some piecemeal reforms to the apartheid policy without relinquishing, giving up white minority control. He scrapped what he called outdated and unnecessary apartheid status laws, such as the outlawing of mixed marriages and sex across color line, to present a new image of reformist change to the world. It almost succeeded. The Western powers, ever eager to read the South African situation optimistically, positively, we deceived for a time in believing that Botha was really dismantling apartheid. But on a close examination, when Botha unveiled constitutional changes, he intended making it become clear what he had in mind was not reform, but rather a reformulation, restructuring of apartheid. He set out his plan to establish a tricameral parliament in which the mixed race, colored and Indian minorities would have separate chambers to legislate their own affairs, while the existing much larger whites-only House of Assembly would deal with both white issues and the nation's remote tribal Bantustans. Remember, we spoke about Bantustans, our reserves, basically. The municipal councils would run their separate black townships in so-called white South Africa, but even these urban councils were not autonomous, free. The legislation enabled the white ministers to remove members, appoint others, or dismiss the whole council and appoint a new one. It meant that the black councils had to implement government policies rather than to be responsive to their electorates, basically. Now let's go to the questions and the answers. So the first question is as follows. 1.1.1, name two apartheid status. In the source that P.W. Botha scrapped while introducing reforms to the apartheid policy, mark your location 2 times 1, and the answer is as follows. We can see it is a level 1 question, basically, and the answer as follows. mixed marriages, sex across color line. So those were so we only need two answers. So the mark allocation was 2 times 1, meaning you will provide two answers and you will get 1 mark per answer basically. Now let's go to the next question. Explain what is implied by the statement. What EPW had in mind was not reform, but rather a reformulation, destruction of apartheid 1 times 2 basically. Means one answer must be provided. We can see it's a level 2 question. It means interpretation and evaluation needs to take place. Now let's look at the answer that's provided. P.W. Botha's intention was not to dismantle apartheid, but to reinforce, revamp, renew, restructure it in a different way. Basically, in the source, it states revamp or it says form basically at the end of the day. So that you can see, learners, there's a 2 marks for one answer basically. Then we have another answer. P.W. Botha's intention was to ensure that white minority would retain their political powers. That's not in the source. Then the third answer that you could have provided, P.W. Botha wanted to create the impression that the minority groups were included in the power sharing government basically. P.W. Botha's intended changes were cosmetic, as whites would still deal with white issues and have a say over the majority of the issues. P.W. Botha wanted apartheid to look less discriminatory to the outside world, basically. Any other relevant responses, but we only need 2 answers, and we have provided basically 5 answers here. Now let's go to the next question. Define the term tricameral parliament in your own words. Mark allocation 1 times 2 basically. Now let's go to the answers. We can see level 1 question because it's in your own words. Own words means from the dictionary. Take note, own words means from the dictionary. Remember, learners, that definitions are never in the source. To define a particular word, the answer is never in the source, basically. Then the answer is as follows. The tricameral parliament was a 3-chamber parliament for white, colored, Indian representatives, while Africans were excluded, basically. Then another answer, the tricameral parliament had 3 separate chambers where coloreds and Indians representatives were made to believe they could oversee their own affairs while whites dealt with the affairs of all. Any relevant response in connection with the same question. Now let's go to the next question, 1.1.4. Using the information in the source in your own knowledge, explain why you think the black majority was excluded from the legislation. Look at the mark allocation 2 times 2. It means you must provide 2 answers, 1 answer, 2 marks basically. Let's go to the answers. It's a level 2 question. Provision was made for them to vote in the Bantustans. Municipal, local councils, the National Party granted them political rights in Bantustans. If included, they would outvote white voters. Why? Because the whites were in the minority, basically. If included, they would change the apartheid laws and address the inequality. Then Africans would not be able to fight for their rights, basically, to protect white privileges. This is why they were not included, to weaken resistance against apartheid, because they said you've got your own homelands, basically. And we only need 2 answers, but 1 answer is 2 marks, and that will give you the 4, basically. Now let's go to the last question of the source, 1.1.4 or 1.1.5. Identify 4 legislative powers in the source that the white minister had over black urban councils. You must provide 4. 1 will be 1 mark only, basically. Now let's look at the answer. You can see it's a level 1 question. Remove members, appoint others, dismiss the whole council, and the last one, appoint a new one. So that will be the 4 marks for this particular question. Now let's go to the next topic. The next topic is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It also stands known as TRC, basically. Now, the TRC was established after 1994, basically. So very important that we understand. And whose idea was the Truth and Reconciliation? It was then President Nelson Mandela that introduced the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, basically. Now, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was basically like a court-like assembly. It was like a court-like assembly. Now, if the incident, what happened is they had to look for atrocities that was committed from 1960 to 1994, basically. So what transpired here, learners, is that they had to look at atrocities. When you say atrocities, it means crimes that were committed from 1960 up until 1994. So the crime had to be politically motivated. Now take note, learners, that more than 7,000 people applied to be heard by the TRC. From the 7,000, basically, 2,000 was allowed to be heard by the TRC. From the 2,000, 1,000, just more than 1,700 received what we call amnesty. Now, I will explain the whole process to you. Remember, it was like a court-bodied assembly. If the crime was committed in Natal, in Durban, so within Durban, in town, they would go to the civics center, which is the hall in town, and they would meet basically there. If the crime was committed in Chatsworth in Durban, they would go to Chatsworth, and this is where it would be held. If the crime was committed in Alexander, in Johannesburg, so they go to Alexander in the community hall, and they would set up a court-like structure there, and the process would be unveiled. Now, the leader of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was Archbishop Desmond Tutu. His assistant was Alex Bowring, and these two gentlemen were running the process of the TRC, basically. Now, remember, now this was to investigate atrocities, crimes that were committed from 1960 to 1994, basically. Now the TRC worked like this. Like I said, 7,000 applied, only more than 2,000 people were allowed to be heard. What happened is there were three committees, basically. The first one was basically where it was the human rights violation, where you presented your case, basically. Now, take note, there were two people involved. It was the victim and the perpetrator. Now, some of the victims died. So the family represented the victim during that point in time. The perpetrator, he was the one that basically committed the offense. So it's important that we understand these terminologies when we come to the truth and reconciliation. Then, very important, why was it established? It was basically established to heal the wounds of the past. Now, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was not based on retributive justice. Now, take note, after World War II, all the generals of Nazi Germany, they were sent to court and they received retributive justice. Retributive justice means punishment was given to them. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was based upon restorative justice. You take the victim forgives the perpetrator, now healing takes place. But what happened is, at the human rights violation committee, this is where the case was presented. Then the next committee was what we call basically, so the next committee was the amnesty committee. So the amnesty committee is where you received amnesty or not, basically. Then the third committee was basically the now what we call the rehabilitation, or basically it is where you receive, if you were the victim, you receive a sum of about 30,000 rand, or if you were the perpetrator, you would now be given counseling. Rehabilitation would take place basically there. Counseling was also available for the victims at the same time. Now, these were the three committees basically. Now, take note, the perpetrator is the one that committed the crime, and that was basically always violent, basically. So the amnesty was only granted if you told the truth, and the crime must be politically motivated. That is where you receive amnesty. Very important. You had to tell the truth, and the crime must be political, and then you receive amnesty, basically. So the TRC was a crucial component for a transition from apartheid into a free democratic South Africa. Then it was a public forum, like I indicated, and the procedures were broadcast live on television daily, basically. And it started basically, take note, it started basically after 1994, and basically 1998, they had to hand over all the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, some people feel that it was a success because they found closure, because now they knew what happened to their loved one that went missing. Others felt it was a dismal failure because they didn't find closure. Like the family, like Steve Biko, his family felt like there was no closure because why? The police indicated that they killed him, but no one took responsibility who gave him the final blow that led to his death, basically. So this is a synopsis. So the Truth and Reconciliation question, learners, it is basically based upon case studies. It could be a case study of Archbishop Desmond Tutu or Alex Bowring, or it could be a case study of a particular crime that was committed. Now, source 1A, source 2A, 2B, 2C will be based upon that particular event that occurred, basically. So the Truth and Reconciliation, it's a broad question that will be presented to you. So we don't know which case study will be utilized to answer this particular question, basically. Now let's quickly go to a source to answer this particular question. Let's go back to the source quickly. This source is as follows. It says the poster below was produced by the TRC. It invites both perpetrators and victims to appear before the TRC and testify about human rights abuses that were committed. Now take note, Human Rights Violation Committee was the first committee where you had to appear, basically. Now let's read the poster quickly. It says, if your mother was tortured, your father murdered, and children abducted, would you be silent? Let's speak out to each other by telling the truth, by telling our stories of the past so that we can walk the road to reconciliation together. Truth, the road to reconciliation. Now let's go to the questions being asked here. 2.2.1, why did the TRC decide to produce this poster? So now let's look at the type of question. It's a level 2 question, meaning interpretation is needed here, basically. Now, this is the answer that's being provided: to encourage, appeal, to invite people, victims, perpetrators to come forward and tell the stories of human rights abuses. Now, learners, we can clearly see this is not on the source, basically. Yes, we see the wording, so we need to interpret the wording that's there. It's to invite people to come. Now, it's for victim and perpetrator to come forward and tell their stories to the human rights of the human rights abuses, to establish a record of human rights atrocities committed during the apartheid regime, to provide an opportunity for victims to come forward to voice out the nature and extent of harm they had suffered so that they could be compensated and their dignity restored, basically to show that the government was committed to heal the wounds from atrocities committed during apartheid, to foster reconciliation between perpetrators and victims in South Africa, to make people aware of the work of the TRC, any other relevant response that is in relation to this topic and the question is being dealt with. Let's go to the next question, 2.2.2. Comment on why you think the TRC used the words, if your mother was tortured, father murdered, would you be silent? On the poster in the context of the TRC. Again, interpretation, evaluation is needed. Mark your location 2 times 2, meaning 2 answers must be provided, basically. Let's look at the answers. To encourage victims not to remain silent from human rights abuses committed to his or her family members, because they're talking about a mom, a mother here, that they're talking about sister here. Let's look at another, the next answer. Murder, abducted, and tortured were regarded as human rights abuses that the TRC wanted to expose, basically. Victims of human rights abuses like murder and torture should not be silenced and suffer in silence. Also, to encourage victims of gross human rights violation to come forward and tell their stories at the TRC by speaking out, seeking the truth. Victims can find closure. Basically, government wanted to ensure that such human rights abuses do not happen again, basically to invoke empathy by sharing their stories. So learners, when we look at level 2, you must have studied the content. If you did not study the content, it becomes difficult to give answers in this fashion, basically. But take note, there must be 2 answers. Why? Because the mark location says 2 times 2, basically. Now let's go to the next question. Explain the term reconciliation in the context of the TRC. Mark your location 1 times 2 basically. Level 2 in the context means always level 2 question. So the first answer is that the state of affairs in which victims and perpetrators of human rights abuses would live in peace and harmony, friendly relations, restoration of broken relations between victims and perpetrators. The process through which victims of human rights abuses would have to forgive perpetrators who would have undertaken full disclosure of human rights abuses they committed basically. So there is the 2 answers already. So any other relevant responses? So take note, 1 answer, 2 marks basically at the end of the day. Now let's go to the paragraph question quickly. 2.6, using the information and relevance in your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines, about 80 words. Now learners, 8 lines minimum. It must be more than 8 lines. 80 words minimum, more than 80 words always basically. Explain how the Truth and Reconciliation Commission dealt with the murder of political activist Griffith Mzingi. That's 8 marks basically, a level 3 question. Look at the, now the answers here is provided in bullet form. It must not be in bullet form. It must basically be in a paragraph form, and the paragraph means that they flow into each other. If you write in bullet form, you will not get more than 2 marks if you have all the facts. So this is why avoid that. Continue writing in a paragraph basically. So the first answer is the TRC was established to investigate human rights abuses that were committed during apartheid. That is retrieved from. So you indicate where you found the information also from. So you cannot copy paste. It must be paraphrased. The TRC was established to give perpetrators of human rights abuses amnesty in exchange for whole truth basically retrieved from 2A. The TRC identified torture, murder, abduction as some of human rights abuses. Source 2B, the TRC encouraged victims to come forward and speak out in order to facilitate reconciliation. Where did we find this answer? 2B basically. Then it continues. Dirk Coetzee applied for amnesty for his involvement in the killing of ANC activist Griffith Mzingi. To see, Dirk Coetzee was given a chance to tell his story in front of the TRC and disclose the whole truth. So to see, the TRC was convinced that Dirk Coetzee had told the whole truth and that he had a political motive for killing Griffith Mzingi. 2D, TRC granted Dirk Coetzee amnesty for the murder of Griffith Mzingi. 2D, the TRC acted in accordance with the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act 1995, Act 30 of 1995, own knowledge basically. And yes, learners, there is basically the now the answers that we can basically write down for this particular paragraph. Now let's quickly go to the essay part. Basically, let's deal with the content. Then we'll look at the introduction paragraph and conclusion paragraph and how you should implement the Peel method. But let's go to section B, question 4. The first bullet, these are examination bullets. It means this is what is supposed to be in your essay. So the first bullet talks about the nature and the aim of Black consciousness. When we talk about the nature and the aims of Black consciousness, it means why was Black consciousness introduced basically. So we all know that Black consciousness was introduced because there was a political vacuum. It means that the ANC and PAC, they were banned. So banned means basically they were expelled and they went into exile basically. Some went to prison, some were in prison, and some went into exile basically. Now, it's important that we understand the word exile means you are a political threat to your country. So the ANC members and the PAC members were a political threat to South Africa, and this is why some went into exile, some was in prison, basically. So that was basically the nature, why it was introduced, basically because of the political vacuum. Now, what was the aim? Because Black people felt that they were inferior, so Black consciousness came to instill and say, listen here, you are not inferior, you are superior also. It doesn't mean you are Black, you can't do things for yourself. It means now Black was psychologically saying to himself, I'm inferior, then the white person is superior. And that was basically now the aim was to unravel, to to conscientize the mind of the black person that you are superior, you are valuable basically. And the aim was to unite blacks in South Africa to fight against the system of apartheid also at the same time. But very important that the black consciousness was a philosophy. It was an idea by Steve Biko basically. So now we talk about the role of Steve Biko now. The role of Steve Biko is, yes, we mentioned just briefly, he was a student at the University of Natal, starting to become a doctor. He was part of NUSAS. NUSAS was a multiracial organization. They didn't understand the conditions that black people had to face when they leave the university. At the same time, because they didn't understand the conditions that black people had to face when they leave the university, the black people now started their own organization under the leadership of Steve Biko now. And that now, within itself now, it means now, when this philosophy came forth, the apartheid government accepted it. They said it's fine. But when CESO was now introduced, now what did CESO do now? CESO was at university level. So now the person that was starting to become a doctor, the black person, went into the community. The psychologist starting to become a psychologist went into the community. The teacher went into the community, and they started an organization called Black People's Convention. So through the Black People's Convention, they began to conscientize the minds of the black people that they are worth something. They're not inferior. They are of value, basically. Then what transpired is that through the Black People's Convention, different community organizations was basically started, like the community organization, where they actually started off by Steve Biko in King Williamstown, when he was basically arrested because he was under house arrest. So he was under house arrest, and what happened is he started organizations like healthcare facilities, like clinics, basically, Zanompilo, Solompilo, basically. And he started also literacy schemes, also after school care, tutoring, also feeding schemes was started also through the Black consciousness movement, basically. And this was done through the Black People's Convention, basically. Then it did not only impact in the local community, but also in the workplace. And this is where BAU was established. The workers' union was basically established to fight against the rights of workers. So we need to explain now how BAU was established. Because of the strike in Durban, basically, they became influential in supporting the black workers in the factories, basically. Then also, because of the community project that was established, it now influenced basically the workers also, but it also influenced the learners at school. And this is where SESM came into being. Now the South African student movement was established. So the South African student movement was established because of the influence of the teachers in the townships now, basically. And this led now to what we call the SRCs, the Student Representative Councils. So what happened now is we can basically see the influence of black consciousness within the black community. So in 1974, the government came up with a idea, basically, that Afrikaans must be introduced in Soweto, basically. And what happened is in 1975, it was discussed, and it was basically introduced already. So when it was introduced in 1975, in 1976, it became now a reality. So what transpired is that the teachers now, which was part of CESO, they were now teachers now. So they influence now the learners. And in Soweto, the SRC came together at a school called Morrison Isaacs in White City. So when they got together there, they planned to have a march on June 16, 1976. So what transpired is all the schools in Soweto decided to gather at Orlando Stadium. But when the schools from the southeast part, when they were marching, they basically came to basically now to Vilakazi Street, which is basically where you will find the house of late President Nelson Mandela. So when they came to Vilakazi Street after they went to Pafeni High, the police asked them to turn back. Remember now, the other crowds, the other learners were already at Orlando Stadium. They refused to turn back, and what happened is they set the dogs on them, and shooting basically started, and innocent learners were killed. So what transpired that basically is that not only did the uprising start in Soweto because they refused to turn back, then they started, now the students for the very first time started to burn buildings. Black people started to burn buildings for the very first time that was associated with the system of apart, meaning buildings that belong to the government. Basically, they started uh, uh, burning buses. They started burning community halls. Schools were basically also burned at the same time. So that violence now started in Soweto, but it spread right across the country. So 1976, the school year was cancelled, and they had to resume again in 1977, meaning now everyone that was in school 1976 had to restart school again 1977. So if you were in grade 12, 1976, you had to redo that year in 1977. So now we can see the influence of Black consciousness. So remember, Black consciousness was just an ideology, a philosophy of Steve Biko. But take note, a lot of people adopted this idea and this philosophy. Why? Because they realized that they are word and they are something basically. So now we can clearly see that because also of the independence of the African countries, Angola and Mozambique, that also ignited the Black people in South Africa to fight for their rights at the same time also. Now take note, Steve Biko, after he was arrested, put under house arrest, went to Cape Town, came back, was arrested on his way to his home. He was sent to Port Elizabeth. He was tortured, beaten up. He was unconscious. He was put in a Land Rover police van, transported 1,200 kilometers from Port Elizabeth to Pretoria. Got to Pretoria, he was announced dead. The minister indicated he died because of hunger strike. But the investigation through Helen Ziller and a newspaper, they found out that he died because of brain damage, basically. So the legacy of Biko continued to live on. And how did it continue to live on? Because remember now, Steve Biko died now in September 1977. But the Black conscious philosophy moved on into the 1980s, basically. And because of the Black conscious philosophy, and it actually initiated what we call the June 16, 1976 uprising in Soweto. So that is a synopsis of this particular essay, basically. So let's look at the question that you might be confronted with. To what extent did Steve Biko and the Black consciousness ideology contribute to the 1976 student protests? Support your line of argument by using relevant. So we'll look at the introduction and conclusion with this question. So the introduction should look like this. To a great extent, the Black conscious movement contributed to the 1976. So here we can see this is what we call the stance, basically, learners. This is our stance. And then we move to the green part. So the green part is BCM, Black consciousness. It is important, learners, that you write out the word full, the abbreviation in brackets, and then after you utilize the abbreviation. So the BCM and Biko fill the Black community with a newfound pride in themselves, their efforts, their value systems, their culture, heritage, their religion, and their outlook to life. Black learners were also influenced by CESO to stand up for their rights. So there we have information from the content. So if we didn't study the content, we will not be able to have a reason, basically. Then the orientation, in the next paragraphs, I will be explaining how the Black consciousness contributed to the 1976 Soweto protest, basically. Now let's go to the conclusion, basically. So remember what I said. The same stance that you took in the introduction, it must be seen basically in the conclusion. But you must indicate that you are in concluding, or in conclusion, or by tying up my essay. To a greater extent, the Black consciousness movement contributed to the 1976 protests in Soweto. BCM and Biko Infuse filled the Black community with a newfound pride in themselves, their efforts, their value system, their culture, heritage, their religion, and their outlook to life. The above information was elaborated on how BCM has really contributed to the 1976 protest in Soweto. So that concludes now the essay within itself. So remember, learners, if you have a good introduction, good conclusion, and you can argue your question basically by utilizing the Peel method, then you are bound to get 50 out of 50 basically. Now let's go to what we call, this is question 6, not question 6, question 5, basically the coming of democracy. So it starts basically with the negotiations. But remember now, we give the introduction and we give a background. So the background is basically where FW, the clerk makes his announcement on 2nd of February that on 11 March, Nelson Mandela will be released, and before that, other political prisoners will also be released, and political organizations that was banned will be unbanned now. So it starts with the negotiations with the Grote Skeer. So I'm just going over it so that you can have an understanding. It starts with the Grote Skeer. Now you must mention who was part of the Grote Skeer, basically. ANC, National Party, who was the leaders, and what did they discuss there? They discussed the indemnity of political prisoners and how they will come back into the country. And what did they sign? The Grote Skeer Minute. But then thereafter, there was violence in Sebokeng. Then we move over, then we speak about the Pretoria Minute. What did they discuss in Pretoria? They discussed basically ANC must, ANC unbanned Umkhonto we Sizwe. The National Party removed the state of emergency, what they signed, the Pretoria Minute. Then we move over, then we can talk about also the weapons that was banned by the Goldstone Commission, basically. And then we need to indicate also that, yes, then thereafter it was CODESA 1, when in December 1990, basically, who met? 19 political organizations met in Kempton Park. Why? To create a new constitution, but they came to the conclusion that they will create an interim constitution, and then the political organization that will win the election will now sit again with all the organizations, and they will create a new constitution only after the elections, basically. Then there was a referendum. Then what did they sign after CODESA 1? The Declaration of Intent. Then there was a referendum after the referendum. Why a referendum? Because there was a split amongst the white people because of the Conservative Party that won elections, basically. And what transpired is the referendum, 68% of the white people indicated continue with the negotiating process, basically. Then CODESA 2 was not so successful because why? They could not reach consensus on power sharing, basically. And also Mandela also accused the clerk and the National Party of being the third force of aiding the killing of members of black people in South Africa. So ANC walked out of CODESA 2 and they started Operation Rolling Mass Action. Then it was the Boipatong massacre that actually forced them to leave CODESA 2 at the same. But you must explain what transpired at Boipatong at the same time also. Then thereafter, it was the Bishu massacre where Cyril Ramaphosa took basically a group of ANC people. They went to the border of Ciskei. The soldiers began to shoot at them, and then people were killed, people were injured. Cyril Ramaphosa met in secret with the Rolf Meyer. They came basically to the record of understanding, and then only in September 1992, they agreed to sign the record of understanding. Then thereafter, Joe Slovo came up with a sunset clause, meaning that all government workers, their work were guaranteed for 10 years. And after the work being guaranteed for 10 years, they now indicated also a date where the election would take. This is a sunset clause. Then the election process was almost derailed where Janas Vallas executed Chris Hani, or assassinated Chris Hani, basically, and the driver was Darby Lewis. A white woman saw what transpired, phoned the husband phoned the cops. They were caught in a radius of 10 kilometers. de Klerk lost control of South Africa. Nelson Mandela had to come in and calm the nation down. Then you must also basically mention about the AWB when they stormed the World Trade Center, what did they demand? And we must also speak basically about the now the role of the Bantustan leaders, also the homeland leaders, how they refuse to relinquish their status also. But what is important is that the Vryheid Front joined the election about 3 weeks before, the IFP a week before, and the ANC won the election with 63%. Nelson Mandela was elected as the first black democratic president within South Africa. And this is the road to democracy, the essay basically. Learners, so I've given you a brief overview of the content that you should know basically. We dealt with question 1, which is the internal resistance in South Africa. We dealt with the TRC, which is question 2. Section A, we dealt with question 4, which is basically the Steve Biko Black Conscious Movement. We dealt with question 5, the road to democracy. Learners, I know that you will do well. Just go again through the notes, go again through the recordings. These recordings will guide you to ensure that you are on the right path, basically. If you follow this, you will do well. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.